Every single empire in history thought their currency was permanent. The Romans believed the denarius would last forever. The British believed the pound would rule the world forever. And right now, in 2025, millions of Americans believe the dollar will always be king. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Every single one of those empires was wrong. And the pattern? It's always the same. Today, I'm going to walk you through the exact playbook, how reserve currencies die, who killed them, and what the historical evidence tells us about what comes next for the dollar. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will never look at your wallet the same way again. Part 1. What is a reserve currency, and why does it matter to you? Let me start with a question most people never ask. Why does America get to print money, and the whole world just accepts it? Think about that for a second. The US Federal Reserve prints a piece of paper. It costs them maybe 1 cent to produce. And the entire world, China, India, Saudi Arabia, Germany, they all agree that piece of paper is worth $1. Why? The answer is reserve currency status. And it is, without exaggeration, the single greatest financial privilege any nation can hold. Here's what it actually means. When countries trade with each other, oil, wheat, semiconductors, weapons, they need a common language of money, a neutral currency both sides trust. For the last 80 years, that currency has been the US dollar, which means oil is priced in dollars, gold is priced in dollars, international debt is issued in dollars. If Brazil wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they first have to buy dollars. If Indonesia wants to import machinery from Germany, the transaction often goes through dollars first. This creates something called global dollar demand. And that demand? It's the reason America can run massive deficits, borrow cheaply, and fund a military that operates on every continent, all without immediately feeling the economic pain that would crush any other country. Economists call this exorbitant privilege. It's a real term, and it's exactly as powerful as it sounds. But here's the thing nobody tells you. That privilege has been earned and lost multiple times in history. And every time a reserve currency died, the empire holding it thought it was invincible. Let me show you exactly how it happened, because the story starts not in America, but in ancient Rome. Part 2. The first collapse, Rome and the denarius. The year is 211 BC. Rome is at the peak of its military power. And they just introduced a new coin, the denarius. Silver, reliable, trusted across the entire Mediterranean world. For the next 4 centuries, the denarius was essentially the reserve currency of the known world. Roman merchants traded in it from Britain to Egypt to Persia. Other kingdoms held it in their treasuries. It was the dollar of the ancient world. So what went wrong? The answer is debasement. Rome's empire was expensive. Wars, infrastructure, a massive standing army, bureaucracy, and over time, Rome's emperors discovered a very dangerous trick. Instead of raising taxes, which made people angry, they could just make the coins slightly less silver. In 211 BC, the denarius was 90% pure silver. By 268 AD, just under 500 years later, it was less than 2% silver. Think about what that means. Rome essentially printed money by hollowing out its own currency. And at first, nobody noticed. Trade continued, the empire kept functioning, the military kept getting paid. But here's where things took a dark turn. The merchants noticed. The foreign kingdoms noticed. The soldiers noticed because the coins they were being paid with bought less and less every year. Prices across the Roman Empire started rising rapidly. Historians estimate Rome experienced inflation rates that in some periods exceeded 1,000% per year. The social contract broke down. Soldiers refused to fight. Provinces declared independence. Tax collection collapsed. The empire that had ruled the world for centuries fragmented, weakened, and eventually fell. All of it started with the slow, quiet death of their currency. Sound familiar? I'm going to come back to that. But first, let's jump forward 1,000 years. Because the next reserve currency story is even more dramatic. Part 3. Spain and the Silver Empire. Wealth that destroyed itself. The year is 1545. Spanish explorers discover Potosi, a mountain in modern-day Bolivia that is almost entirely made of silver. This was, at the time, the single greatest treasure discovery in human history. Spain had struck the ultimate jackpot. They now controlled more silver than the entire rest of the world combined. The Spanish real, their silver coin, became the first truly global reserve currency, not just regional like Rome, actually global. It was accepted in China, India, the Middle East, West Africa, and all of Europe. For nearly 200 years, Spain was the financial superpower of the world. So how did they lose it? Here's the lesson that most history books skip over. Spain didn't lose its reserve currency status because of military defeat. They lost it because of something much more insidious. They had too much money, and they didn't build anything with it. All that silver flowing in from South America? Spain spent it. On wars. On luxury goods imported from other countries. On a massive church bureaucracy. On maintaining an empire that cost more to run every year. Meanwhile, England, France, and the Netherlands were building factories, trade companies, financial systems. The Dutch East India Company, the world's first multinational corporation, was generating returns of 40% annually for its investors. Spain was consuming wealth, everyone else was creating it. And when the silver mines eventually started running dry, when the easy money stopped, Spain had nothing left. No industrial base, no trade networks they controlled, no financial innovation, just debt. By the mid-1700s, Spain had defaulted on its debts, and historians say it's one of the most frequent defaulters in modern history. The Spanish real faded, and a new power stepped forward, the Dutch guilder, and then, the British pound. Part 4, The Dutch Miracle, and why it ended. I want to spend a moment on the Dutch because most people skip straight from Spain to Britain, and that's a mistake. The Dutch Republic in the 1600s was by any measure the most sophisticated financial system in the world. They invented the stock exchange, they invented modern banking, they created futures contracts, options trading, and bond markets. Amsterdam was the financial capital of the world, and the Dutch guilder was its currency. The Dutch were brilliant. So why did they fall? Simple. They were too small. The Dutch Republic had a population of maybe 2 million people at its peak of power. Britain had 10 million. You can have the most innovative financial system in the world, but if you don't have the population, the military, and the geographic scale to back it up, eventually, a larger power will absorb your role. The Dutch were conquered by France in 1795. Their financial supremacy was already fading before that. And the lesson is critical. Reserve currency status is not just about financial innovation. It requires military power. It requires scale. It requires the ability to enforce the system, which is exactly why Britain was the perfect successor. Part 5. The British pound, the closest parallel to today. Now we get to the story that every dollar analyst should be studying obsessively. Because what happened to the British pound is the closest historical parallel to what may be happening to the dollar right now. Britain in 1815 was the undisputed superpower of the world. They had just defeated Napoleon. The British Empire covered 1/4 of the Earth's land surface. The Royal Navy controlled every major sea lane, and the British pound, backed by gold under the gold standard, was the world's reserve currency. For nearly a century, this system worked beautifully. British banks financed railways in America, mines in South Africa, plantations in India. Capital flowed outward from London to every corner of the globe. The pound was trusted, stable, the anchor of international trade. And then came World War I. Here's what most people don't know. Britain didn't lose reserve currency status because they lost a war. They won the war, but winning nearly bankrupted them. The cost of World War I for Britain was staggering. They went from being the world's largest creditor nation, meaning everyone owed them money, to being deeply in debt to the United States. In 4 years of war, Britain spent more money than it had accumulated over the previous century. And, to pay for it, they did something that quietly signaled the beginning of the end. They temporarily suspended the gold standard. They started printing money. After the war, they tried to go back. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, made one of the most consequential economic decisions in British history. He restored the pound to its pre-war gold value. The problem? The British economy had fundamentally weakened. The pound was overvalued. British exports became too expensive. Unemployment exploded. The economy contracted. And then came 1929. The Great Depression hit. Britain's financial system cracked. In 1931, they abandoned the gold standard permanently. The pound lost 25% of its value almost overnight. But the final blow came from World War II. By 1945, Britain was exhausted, financially devastated. They had borrowed massively from America to fund the war effort. Their empire was beginning to crack under independence movements, from India to Africa to the Middle East. And America, fresh from the war, its industrial base untouched, holding 2/3 of the world's gold, was ready to take over. In July 1944, 44 nations met at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And in that meeting, they redesigned the entire global financial system. The dollar replaced the pound, officially, completely. With the full agreement of the international community, Britain didn't fight it. They couldn't. They needed American loans just to keep their economy functioning. The pound, which had been the world's reserve currency for over a century, was reduced to a regional currency almost overnight. Now here is the critical question, and I want you to really sit with this. What were the warning signs before the pound lost its status? Because this is where the story gets very relevant to today. Part 6. The 6 warning signs. And how many aptly to America today? After studying every major reserve currency transition in history, economists and historians have identified a clear pattern. 6 warning signs that appear, sometimes decades before the actual transition. Every single time. Let me walk you through all 6. And as I do, I want you to keep a mental checklist for the United States. Warning sign number 1. Debt beyond sustainable levels. Every reserve currency holder in decline was drowning in debt. Rome was financing its legions with debased coins. Spain was borrowing against future silver shipments. Britain emerged from 2 world wars, owing more than its entire annual economic output. The United States today has a national debt exceeding $36 trillion. Its debt-to-GDP ratio is above 120%. The last time America ran a genuine budget surplus was in the year 2001. Every year since, they have spent more than they collected, and the interest payments alone on that debt now exceed $1 trillion annually, more than the entire U.S. defense budget. Warning sign number 2. Military overextension. Every declining reserve currency empire was maintaining a military presence far large. Its economy could sustainably support. Britain had garrisons on every continent. Rome had legions from Scotland to Mesopotamia. America currently has military bases in over 70 countries. It spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. And recent decades have seen costly, prolonged conflicts that produced no clear strategic victory. Warning sign number 3. Loss of manufacturing dominance. The reserve currency power is always the world's dominant producer. When that production shifts elsewhere, the currency follows. Britain lost its manufacturing dominance to America and Germany in the late 1800s and early 1900s. America lost significant manufacturing to China over the last 3 decades. In 1980, America accounted for roughly 28% of global manufacturing output. Today, that number is closer to 16%, while China has surpassed 28%. Warning sign number 4. Rivals building alternative systems. Before the dollar replaced the pound, America was quietly building the infrastructure of dollar dominance for decades. American banks, American trade networks, American gold reserves. Today, China and Russia have been systematically building alternatives to dollar-denominated systems. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now several others, have been conducting trade in local currencies. China and Saudi Arabia have discussed oil settlements in Chinese yuan. Russia has been priced out of the dollar system by sanctions and has pivoted entirely to alternative payment rails. The infrastructure of an alternative is being assembled, slowly but deliberately. Warning sign number 5. Inflation eroding trust. The reserve currency must be trusted to hold its value. The moment trading partners start worrying that the currency is being inflated away, they start diversifying. America experienced its worst inflation in 40 years between 2021 and 2023. The Federal Reserve printed trillions of dollars during COVID. The M2 money supply, a measure of total money in circulation, increased by more than 40% in just 2 years. Foreign central banks noticed. Warning sign number 6. Political dysfunction and loss of institutional credibility. This one is subtle, but historically critical. The reserve currency issuer must be seen as a stable, reliable steward of the global financial system. Political instability, institutional breakdown, or aggressive weaponization of the currency erodes that trust. America froze Russia's dollar reserves in 2022, nearly $300 billion. It sent a message to every other country in the world. If America decides you're an enemy, your dollar reserves can disappear overnight. Multiple central banks responded by accelerating gold purchases and reducing dollar holdings. That wasn't coincidence. That was a direct response to watching the dollar being used as a weapon. 6 warning signs. Every single one has a modern American parallel. Now, does that mean the dollar is about to collapse tomorrow? No. And this is where I need to be honest with you, because oversimplifying this would be doing you a disservice. Part 7. Why the dollar is harder to replace than you think. Here's the thing that dollar collapse advocates often get wrong. Replacing a reserve currency is not just a financial decision, it's a civilizational infrastructure project, and it takes decades. Consider what underpins dollar dominance right now. First, the network effect. Over 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. Over 50% of global trade is invoiced in dollars. The entire infrastructure of international finance, SWIFT, correspondent banking, derivatives markets, is dollar-denominated. You cannot simply switch that off like a light. Second, there is no obvious replacement. The euro? The eurozone is structurally fragmented. 20 countries sharing a currency but not a fiscal policy. The yuan? China still maintains capital controls. Foreign investors cannot freely move money in and out of China. A reserve currency requires an open capital account. China hasn't provided that. Gold? There isn't enough of it to support global trade volumes. Third, the dollar has survived prediction of its death many times before. In the 1970s, when Nixon ended the gold standard. In the 1980s, when the Japanese yen was supposed to take over. In the early 2000s, when the euro was going to displace it. The dollar is still here. But, and this is crucial, surviving is different from thriving. The pound didn't vanish overnight. It took 30 years from the first major cracks in World War I to the formal handover at Bretton Woods in 1944. During those 30 years, the pound was still widely used, still important, but its dominance was slowly, irreversibly eroding. The question for the dollar is not, will it disappear tomorrow? The question is, are we already in that 30-year transition window? Part 8. The Bretton Woods Moment. How the handover actually happens. Let me go back to 1944 for a moment, because the Bretton Woods Conference is the most important event in modern monetary history, and most people know almost nothing about it. The conference was held at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. 730 delegates from 44 nations attended. They were there to design the post-war international financial system. The British representative was John Maynard Keynes, one of the greatest economists in history. The American representative was Harry Dexter White, a U.S. Treasury official. Keynes came with an extraordinary proposal. He wanted to create a completely new international reserve currency, something called the Bancor, not owned by any nation, neutral, managed by an international body, a currency that would prevent any single country from having exorbitant privilege. It was a genuinely brilliant idea, and America rejected it completely. Why? Would they? America was holding 2/3 of the world's gold. America's economy had just emerged from the war as the only major industrial power with its infrastructure intact. America was in the perfect position to make the dollar the global reserve currency. And so the Bancor died. The dollar won, and Britain, exhausted, indebted, dependent on American loans, had no choice but to accept. Here is the lesson. Reserve currency transitions don't happen in a vacuum. They happen at moments of maximum geopolitical disruption. Wars, financial crises, systemic shocks, when the old order is too weak to resist and the new claimant is strong enough to impose. The question for the 21st century is, what will that disruption moment look like? And will it come from America's weakness or from a challenger's strength? Part 9. China's bide, and why it's more complicated than you think. The obvious candidate to challenge dollar dominance is China. And China has been making deliberate moves in that direction for over a decade. The yuan was added to the IMF's special drawing rights basket in 2016, a symbolic recognition of its growing global role. China has signed bilateral currency swap agreements with over 40 countries. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's massive infrastructure investment program across Asia, Africa, and Europe, has been structured to build yuan-denominated trade relationships. In 2023, Saudi Arabia and China conducted their first oil trade settled in yuan. A small transaction, but symbolically enormous. Remember, the entire petrodollar system was built on the agreement that oil would be priced and settled in dollars. If that agreement breaks down, even partially, it strikes at the core of dollar demand. And yet, China faces structural obstacles that are genuinely serious. The yuan is not freely convertible. If you're a foreign government and you hold yuan reserves, you can't easily move that money in and out of China without permission from Beijing. No serious reserve currency has ever worked that way. The whole point of a reserve currency is that it's available, liquid, and trustworthy anywhere in the world at any time. Beyond that, China's financial markets lack depth and transparency. Its legal system is not seen as independent. Its political system means that financial policy can shift arbitrarily. These are not just Western criticisms. They're concerns shared by many countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America that have direct experience dealing with Chinese financial institutions. China could theoretically solve these problems, but solving them would require a degree of financial opening that might threaten the Communist Party's control over the economy. It's a genuine dilemma. So here's where we are. The dollar is weakening. The yuan is not ready. No other currency has the scale. Gold is making a comeback in central bank reserves, but cannot replace fiat currency for trade settlement. This creates a scenario that historians actually have a name for. Part 10. The interregnum, the most dangerous phase. An interregnum is the period between one ruler and the next. The gap. The vacuum. In monetary history, interregnums are the most dangerous periods, because when no currency is dominant, when the old reserve currency is declining but no new one has emerged, the global financial system becomes unstable. Trade slows, credit becomes scarce, countries retreat into bilateral deals and regional arrangements. Capital doesn't flow freely because there's no trusted common denominator. We saw a version of this in the 1930s. The pound had lost its anchor. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, but the dollar wasn't yet playing its full global role. The result was a decade of competitive currency devaluations, trade wars, rising nationalism, and economic fragmentation. Sound familiar? The world in 2025 looks, in some uncomfortable ways, like the world of the early 1930s. A declining hegemon, rising challengers, trade fragmentation, competitive currency policies, and a global financial system under unprecedented stress. The optimistic scenario is that this transition, like previous ones, is managed gradually, that a new system emerges over decades with minimal catastrophic disruption. The pessimistic scenario is that a major shock, a financial crisis, a geopolitical conflict, a sudden loss of confidence, accelerates the timeline in ways that nobody is prepared for. The realistic scenario is probably somewhere in between. And preparing for it, understanding what's coming, is exactly why studying monetary history matters. Part 11. What actually replaces the dollar? 3 scenarios. Let me lay out the 3 most credible scenarios that economists and geopolitical analysts are seriously discussing. Scenario 1. The slow decline. Dollar remains dominant but weakened. In this scenario, the dollar doesn't collapse, it just slowly loses market share, from 60% of global reserves to 50% to 40%. Other currencies, the yuan, the euro, the Japanese yen, the Indian rupee, take up smaller shares. The world moves toward a multipolar currency system, where no single currency is dominant. This is actually the most historically common outcome. Most reserve currency transitions didn't involve a dramatic collapse. They involved a gradual redistribution of financial power. Britain's pound still exists. It still matters for some purposes. It just no longer dominates. In this scenario, America still has significant power, but it pays a higher price to borrow. It can no longer run unlimited deficits. It loses some of the exorbitant privilege, and that forces difficult domestic adjustments. Scenario 2. The digital disruption. CBDCs and a new system. This scenario is more speculative but increasingly discussed. Several major economies are developing central bank digital currencies, digital versions of their national currencies. China's digital yen is the most advanced. The EU is developing a digital euro. Even the US Federal Reserve has been researching a digital dollar. The argument is that digital currencies could eventually create a new cross-border settlement infrastructure, one that bypasses SWIFT and the existing dollar-dominated system entirely. China has been specifically designing its digital yuan for cross-border trade settlement. If that system gains adoption across the Belt and Road countries, it could create a parallel financial infrastructure that simply routes around dollar dominance. This is years, probably decades, away from being a serious threat. But the groundwork is being laid now. Scenario 3. The crisis accelerant, a shock that forces rapid change. This is the scenario that should make you pay attention. History shows that reserve currency transitions that would normally take decades can be compressed into years by a sufficiently large crisis. What would that crisis look like? It could be a U.S. debt crisis, a moment when markets lose confidence in America's ability to service its debt, triggering a dollar sell-off. It could be a military conflict that demonstrates limits of American power. It could be a financial shock that forces rapid de-dollarization. Nobody knows when or if this happens, but the conditions, high debt, political dysfunction, geopolitical rivalry, are exactly what has preceded every major reserve currency shock in history. Part 12. What this means for India. And for you. Now let me bring this home. Because for viewers in India, and for the global south more broadly, this transition is not just academic. India sits at a fascinating crossroads in this story. On one hand, India has historically been caught in the dollar trap. India imports oil in dollars. India's foreign debt is dollar-denominated. When the dollar strengthens, India's import bill rises, its currency weakens, and its inflation pressures increase. Dollar dominance has often worked against emerging market economies like India. On the other hand, India has been one of the most active players in exploring alternatives. India has been conducting rupee-denominated trade with Russia since 2022, buying discounted Russian oil and paying in rupees. India has been in discussion with multiple countries about bilateral currency arrangements. The rupee is not going to become the next global reserve currency, at least not in our lifetimes. But in a multipolar currency world, the rupee could become the dominant currency for South Asian and Indian Ocean trade. That's a meaningful step up from where India stands today. For individual viewers, wherever you are, the implications are more personal. If the dollar declines even gradually, assets priced in dollars become relatively less valuable over time. Gold, historically the ultimate monetary hedge, becomes more valuable. Commodities become more valuable. Geographic diversification of savings becomes more important. I'm not giving you financial advice, but I am telling you what history says about what happens when reserve currencies decline. People who understood monetary history, who saw it coming, protected their wealth. People who assumed the current system would last forever, didn't. Part 13. The climax, the pattern that never changes. Let me bring everything together now. Because after walking through Rome, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and Britain, a single pattern emerges with almost frightening clarity. Every reserve currency empire believed it was uniquely permanent. Every one of them had legitimate reasons for that belief. The Romans had centuries of dominance. The Spanish had literal mountains of silver. The British had an empire covering a quarter of the earth, and every single one of them made the same set of mistakes. They prioritized military spending over productive investment. They allowed debt to grow beyond sustainable levels. They debased or overexpanded their currency. They failed to adapt their economic model as the world changed around them. And they dismissed early warning signs as temporary, manageable, or simply the complaints of rivals who couldn't compete. The American story, from the perspective of monetary history, fits this pattern uncomfortably well. That doesn't mean the outcome is inevitable. History is not destiny. Empires have arrested their decline before. The United States still has enormous strengths. The world's most innovative technology sector, the deepest capital markets, the strongest military, and institutions that, despite recent strain, remain more functional than most alternatives. But the first step in addressing a problem is acknowledging that the pattern exists, that reserve currency status is not a birthright, that it is earned, and that historically, it has always eventually been lost. The British thought 1913 was permanent. It wasn't. The question for your generation is whether 2025 represents the same kind of hinge point. Whether 50 years from now, historians will look back at this decade and say, that's when it started to turn. I don't know the answer. Nobody does. But I know that the people who understood monetary history, who saw the Roman debasement for what it was, who saw Britain's post-WI borrowing for what it was, were better prepared for what came next. And that preparation starts with understanding the pattern. Pound didn't die in a day. The dollar won't either. But the shift, when it comes, will feel sudden to everyone who wasn't watching. You're watching. That already puts you ahead. If this video changed how you think about money, power, and history, this channel exists for exactly that reason. Finance Historian is not just another economics channel. It's a community of people who believe that understanding the past is the only real defense against being blindsided by the future.